Democratic socialists at another of their conventions, they were told to make jazz hands instead of clapping, lest some delegates suffer sensory overload. And also, and I'm not joking, they were told not to be wearing, any aggressive scents.
Please don't go into that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because that's going to be difficult for people.
Oh, for f***'s sake. This city-run grocery stores? No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal.
It didn't start with a punchline. It started with a fracture. On Real Time with Bill Maher didn't shout into the culture war. He stepped back from it, and in that restraint, the indictment grew louder. In an era where outrage is currency, he committed the quietest act of rebellion. He questioned his own coalition. Not as betrayal, as triage. According to voting trends across the last 3 federal cycles, the decisive shifts in swing districts have hinged less on ideology and more on enthusiasm asymmetry. That is the calm, surgical reality beneath the noise. The villain wasn't progressive policy, it was performance politics, the substitution of viral applause for voter trust, of curated righteousness for coalition maintenance. Real versus fake. Authentic versus manufactured. People versus performance. Psychologically, voters rarely abandon principles in a dramatic break. They disengage when they sense they're being managed instead of heard. And here's the counterpoint that sharpens the edge. Democrats have secured measurable legislative wins in infrastructure, climate investment, and job growth. Tangible policy achievements that polling shows remain broadly popular. The issue isn't absence of results. It's narrative disconnect. When governance feels competent but emotionally distant, voters experience a trust gap. Strategically, if social media affirmation continues to masquerade as national momentum, demographic advantages will thin into turnout deficits. History shows coalitions don't collapse overnight, they erode through complacency. And as the studio lights dimmed, one unsettling thought lingered. Was this a moment of correction, or the warning tremor before a larger political reckoning?
And go along, you're bad, stupid, and deplorable. As if you were saying, duh, 2 + 2 = 5, isn't that obvious? Yeah, it's obvious you can't add. You can't just say shit. Math is racist, queers for Palestine, looting is cool, healthy at any weight. If the men's football team played the women's team, it would be a tie. You can't just say shit.
There was no detonation, just a slow, deliberate unveiling. On Real Time with Bill Maher stepped into the line of fire not as a partisan warrior, but as a truth-teller challenging his own ranks. He didn't accuse Democrats of corruption or cruelty. He accused them of something more dangerous in politics, strategic arrogance. In a climate addicted to moral certainty, he argued persuasion had been replaced by proclamation. According to voting trends in recent federal cycles, independent voters now determine statewide outcomes by margins often smaller than 1%. That is the calm, surgical math beneath the emotion. Based on exit polls and demographic shifts, frustration among swing voters is less about progressive objectives and more about tone, prioritization, and cultural distance. The villain here isn't ideology, it's the behavior of turning politics into a performance, confusing viral affirmation with durable coalition building. Real versus fake. Authentic outreach versus manufactured applause. People versus performance. Psychologically, voters resist being lectured. They want acknowledgement, not instruction. Yet the intelligent counterpoint stands firm. Policy achievements on infrastructure, healthcare costs, and economic stabilization remain broadly supported, suggesting the foundation isn't cracked, the messaging architecture is. Strategically, this isn't left versus right. It's base versus broad alliance, and when purity tests replace persuasion, coalitions shrink under the illusion of strength. If this trajectory holds, turnout asymmetry could quietly redraw the electoral map through 2028 and beyond, not with a dramatic collapse, but with incremental erosion. Power rarely disappears in a single night. It fades when self-examination becomes content instead of correction. And as the cameras stopped rolling, one question hung in the air. Will this moment become a pivot point, or just another clip consumed and forgotten?
Is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think...
It wasn't a joke that landed, it was a realization that cut. On Real Time with Bill Maher held up a mirror to his own side and suggested the reflection was cracking. He framed the crisis not as ideological defeat, but as authenticity under siege, a party reacting to cultural tremors instead of confidently shaping the ground beneath it. According to voting trends and demographic shifts over the past decade, working-class voters across racial lines have not dramatically reversed their core beliefs, they have recalibrated their allegiance. That is the calm, surgical assessment. Based on exit polls in key battleground states, many cited cultural disconnect and tone, not policy hostility, as their reason for drifting. The villain behavior here wasn't compassion or reform, it was condescension, the subtle signal that voters were being instructed rather than engaged. Real conversations replaced by rehearsed language. Authentic outreach overshadowed by manufactured messaging. People versus performance. Psychologically, when citizens feel culturally misread, they don't argue, they disengage. Yet the intelligent counterpoint stands. Economic indicators and legislative data show tangible infrastructure expansion, job growth, and manufacturing investment. Measurable gains that complicate the collapse narrative. Governance, in many respects, has delivered. The strategic failure, as implied, lies in narrative ownership. The inability to translate policy success into emotional connection. In a power struggle, perception often outruns performance. If that disconnect widens, the vacuum will not remain empty. It will be filled by sharper, simpler, and often more polarizing voices. The trend suggests a future where politics becomes less about spreadsheets and more about sentiment, less about fact sheets and more about feeling. And once authenticity is questioned, rebuilding trust becomes a generational project. The lingering question is stark. Will leadership rediscover resonance, or continue mistaking applause inside the room for loyalty outside it?
Have a lot of socialism. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, veterans benefits, Pell Grants, COVID-era payments, farm subsidies, disability payments, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, corporate bailouts, and the jobs program that is building weapons the Pentagon doesn't even want. All that is socialism, much of it appropriate to soften the edges of capitalism, but the DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more. You think you're going to win an election?
It wasn't an attack on the other side. It was an autopsy of his own. On Real Time with Bill Maher turned the spotlight inward and argued that confidence had quietly hardened into complacency. Not corruption. Not collapse. Complacency, the silent killer of coalitions. According to midterm turnout patterns over the last decade, projected demographic advantages have repeatedly failed to translate into decisive victories in battleground districts. That's not spin, that's arithmetic. The villain behavior here isn't progressive ambition. It's the assumption that history bends automatically without persuasion, that favorable trends substitute for ground-level engagement. Real voters versus projected voters. Authentic coalition building versus manufactured inevitability. People versus performance. Psychologically, when citizens are told the outcome is inevitable, they disengage, agency fades, urgency evaporates. A calm, surgical read of electoral data shows enthusiasm margins, not ideological margins, often determine control in competitive states. The intelligent counterpoint is undeniable. Democrats continue to dominate in major urban centers and maintain strength in many suburban regions, reflecting durable demographic foundations. But strongholds defend territory, they don't expand maps. Strategically, power is not preserved by comfort, it is maintained by constant persuasion. If overconfidence persists, incremental seat losses won't feel dramatic in isolation, but compounded over cycles they reshape committees, courts, and national direction. Political erosion rarely announces itself with fireworks, it accumulates in silence. And as the applause faded, one unsettling question remained. Does confidence sharpen into courage, or does it quietly calcify into denial?
Police or military in the streets, either MAGA's crypto crony capitalism or city-run grocery stores? No, I don't want that. I want a Democrat who reassures me if you like your Whole Foods, you can keep your Whole Foods. Governor-elect Spanberger once said about Biden's presidency that, quote, nobody elected him to be FDR. They elected him to be normal. Normal! You know, at this year's DSA convention, or as it's commonly known, Comic-Con, get this, you had to submit a photo of a negative COVID test to get it.
The applause was loud, but the warning was louder. On Real Time with Bill Maher delivered a diagnosis that cut through the studio glow. Cultural dominance is not the same as political dominance. Trending doesn't equal turning out. According to exit polls and voter interviews across recent battleground states, a measurable block of moderates expressed exhaustion, not with reform itself, but with rhetorical escalation and constant moral brinkmanship. That distinction is surgical and crucial. The villain behavior here isn't progressive ambition. It's escalation without calibration, volume without velocity, outrage without strategy. In warfare, you don't win by firing in every direction. You win by choosing terrain and holding it. Real persuasion versus algorithmic validation. Authentic connection versus manufactured viral moments. People versus performance. Psychologically, when politics feels like theater, voters shift from participants to spectators, and spectators don't sacrifice their time on election day. The intelligent counterpoint is undeniable. Progressive ballot initiatives have passed in multiple conservative-leaning states, proving that policy substance can transcend party labels when presented clearly. The foundation isn't broken. The packaging is. A calm reading of electoral data shows that trust and tone increasingly shape margins in suburban swing counties. If authenticity continues to lose ground to algorithmic outrage, the trend line points toward shrinking coalitions and razor-thin defeats. Power rarely evaporates in scandal, it erodes in miscalculation. And as the cameras dimmed, one quiet question lingered in the air. Is the party speaking to voters or performing past them?
This country is founded on, one is democracy and one is capitalism, free markets. And it seems like one party wants to get rid of one and the other party wants to get rid of the other. Right? The Republicans are not that, democracy is just not number one on their list. It just isn't. It isn't. It's behind Christianity and a few other things. And the Democrats, I mean, I read these, 74% are for democratic socialism. Only 16% favor capitalism. Is this going to be a country that I don't recognize in 5 to 10 years if we don't have these two pillars?
It didn't sound like comedy, it sounded like a battlefield briefing. On Real Time with Bill Maher wasn't delivering jokes. He was delivering a warning that felt strategic, almost military in tone. His argument was blunt. Democrats are fighting yesterday's cultural wars while the electorate quietly redraws the map. According to voting trends in suburban counties across the last 2 election cycles, volatility is rising and party loyalty is thinning, a measurable shift, not a media illusion. That's the calm, surgical reality beneath the outrage. The villain isn't reform or ambition, it's stagnation, The repetition of slogans that once mobilized crowds but now echo without expanding them. Real engagement versus recycled applause lines. Authentic persuasion versus manufactured messaging. People versus performance. Psychologically, repetition breeds numbness. When language feels scripted, urgency fades and trust follows. Yet the intelligent counterpoint stands. Generational turnout patterns show younger voters still lean left, offering a long-term structural advantage if effectively cultivated. The foundation is not collapsing, but foundations don't win wars without strategy. Based on exit polls and demographic shifts, persuasion among independents and suburban moderates remains the decisive terrain. If adaptation slows while the electorate recalibrates, political gravity can tilt without warning. Power doesn't disappear in dramatic explosions. It erodes when leaders mistake past victories for future guarantees. In every historical power struggle, survival has favored the side willing to evolve faster than the battlefield changes. And as the segment closed, the unspoken challenge lingered in the air. Will adaptation become action, or will erosion be mistaken for inevitability?
Democrats going with this. If Mondani is the face of the Democrats on the East Coast and Katie Porter is the face on the West Coast, I don't know if that's great politically for that.
It wasn't a policy debate, it was a credibility reckoning. On Real Time with Bill Maher stepped into dangerous territory and argued that the real crisis isn't legislative failure, it's trust erosion. Trust, he implied, is the currency of power, and inflation is rising fast. According to public opinion surveys over the past 5 years, institutional trust has declined across party lines, but dissatisfaction falls heaviest on those currently governing. That's the calm, surgical blade of data cutting through partisan noise. The villain behavior here isn't compromise or compassion. It's defensiveness, dismissing criticism as betrayal instead of treating it as information. Real accountability versus manufactured unity. Authentic dialogue versus choreographed consensus. People versus performance. Psychologically, voters don't demand perfection. They demand acknowledgement. When frustration is minimized, alienation multiplies. Based on exit polls and demographic shifts in competitive states, voters increasingly cite feeling unheard as a deciding factor, not policy specifics, but tone and responsiveness. The intelligent counterpoint deserves weight. Legislative compromises in recent years have prevented extreme policy swings and maintained economic stability, reflecting functional governance in a polarized era. That matters. But governance without narrative clarity creates a vacuum where suspicion thrives. Strategically, credibility doesn't collapse in one scandal. It thins gradually until volatility becomes the norm. And volatility is political wildfire. It reshapes coalitions overnight and punishes complacency. If credibility continues to erode, future elections won't be referendums on ideology, but on trust itself. As the cameras pulled back, one stark realization lingered. Power rarely fades when it's attacked, it fades when it's doubted.
At another of their conventions, they were told to make jazz hands instead of clapping, lest some delegates suffer sensory overload. And also, and I'm not joking, they were told not to be wearing, any aggressive scents.
Please don't go into that space with anything that's like an aggressive scent, for instance, right? Because that's going to be difficult for people.
Oh, for f***'s sake.
It didn't feel like a revolt. It felt like a recalibration under fire. On Real Time with Bill Maher delivered a warning that cut deeper than partisan criticism. Internal applause is not external approval. In a political ecosystem fueled by curated audiences and algorithmic reinforcement, he argued that Democrats risk mistaking base enthusiasm for national consensus. According to voting trends and turnout disparities between primaries and general elections, high-intensity internal support often fails to expand beyond ideological comfort zones. That's the quiet math, and math doesn't care about momentum narratives. The villain behavior here isn't mobilization, it's insulation, echo chambers masquerading as inevitability. Real coalition building versus curated affirmation. Authentic persuasion versus manufactured momentum. People versus performance. Psychologically, group validation feels like strength. It triggers certainty and belonging. But elections are won in discomfort, in persuading skeptics, not reassuring loyalists. Based on exit polls and demographic shifts in competitive districts, swing voters consistently decide outcomes by razor margins, and they respond less to moral intensity than to pragmatic reassurance. The intelligent counterpoint deserves acknowledgement. In polarized cycles, energizing the base is essential to prevent turnout collapse. Yet base-only strategies compress the battlefield and narrow paths to victory. Strategically, insulation breeds overconfidence, and overconfidence shrinks maps. If this trajectory continues, future electoral maps won't collapse dramatically. They'll constrict quietly, seat by seat, county by county. Power doesn't disappear in a headline. It recedes in margins. And as the segment closed, one unsettling truth lingered. In politics, insulation feels like protection until it becomes isolation.
To post messages on social media about the current Trump administration and what's happening to American lives. The problem is they're all literally saying the same damn thing. Don't believe me? Check it out.
If I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one.
That ain't true. That's what you just heard. Since day one of Donald Trump's presidency, prices are not down, they're up. Inflation is getting worse, not better. The prices of grocery, gas, houses,
Now you see why Stephen A. Smith was in the polls as a presidential candidate? You see what I'm talking about? You see.
The laughter faded, and strategy took its place. On Real Time with Bill Maher pivoted from satire to something sharper, warning that cultural dominance in media is not the same as dominance at the ballot box. Trending isn't turning out. Applause isn't arithmetic. According to voting trends and counter-level shifts over the past 2 election cycles, incremental erosion has appeared in once reliable regions, not dramatic collapses, but measurable warning tremors. That's the calm, surgical read of the map. The villain behavior isn't progress or reform, it's overconfidence, mistaking algorithmic validation for electoral security. Real persuasion versus digital affirmation. Authentic coalition building versus manufactured inevitability. People versus performance. Psychologically, when voters hear narratives of inevitability, participation feels symbolic rather than decisive. Urgency declines, and complacency spreads. Based on exit polls and demographic shifts in swing counties, small movements among independents and suburban moderates have repeatedly determined statewide outcomes by razor margins. The intelligent counterpoint is undeniable. Structural advantages in major urban centers and demographic strongholds remain durable, providing a formidable base of support. But bases defend, margins win. Strategically, if complacency calcifies and persuasion slows, narrow defeats risk becoming recurring patterns, not because of ideological rejection, but because of strategic miscalculation. Political power rarely disappears in a single cycle, it recedes through ignored signals. And as the segment closed, one quiet question lingered with unsettling clarity. Are these tremors being measured, or merely dismissed as background noise?
With 22 Democratic senators be literally echoing the same thing and think that would resonate with the American people. All it shows is that the same fabric of our democracy is unchanging in the eyes of some of these officials, and as a result, the constituency they represent, which is why Donald Trump is in office. What, do I have to come up to Capitol Hill and give you lessons? Seriously, you don't get it? All you did, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Chuck Schumer. Let's all get together. Let's put this in a prompter, and all together, albeit in separate rooms, we'll grab a microphone and say the same damn thing. And that's what's going to resonate with the American people. And then you wonder why you're no longer in power.
By the time the segment closed, it no longer felt like commentary. It felt like a crossroads under floodlights. On Real Time with Bill Maher cast himself not as a defector, but as a dissenter-in-chief, arguing that survival in politics demands self-correction before voters impose it for you. This wasn't rebellion. It was a warning shot across his own coalition's bow. According to historical voting trends and past electoral realignments, parties that recalibrate messaging while protecting core principles endure across generations, while those that double down on tone over trust gradually fracture. That's the calm, surgical horizon line. The villain behavior isn't conviction, it's rigidity, mistaking moral clarity for political inflexibility, rehearsed righteousness for authentic reform. Real humility versus manufactured certainty. Authentic persuasion versus ideological performance. People versus performance. Psychologically, voters don't require perfection, they reward responsiveness. When leaders project invulnerability, citizens sense distance, and distance breeds doubt. Based on exit polls and demographic shifts in recent competitive races, adaptability has increasingly defined narrow victories. The intelligent counterpoint deserves respect. Ideological clarity fuels activism, fundraising, and volunteer energy, the lifeblood of modern campaigns. But activism without expansion rarely constructs durable governing majorities. Strategically, coalitions are living organisms. They either widen or wither. If introspection stalls and rigidity hardens, incremental seat losses can evolve into structural disadvantage over time. Political gravity is unforgiving. And as the credits rolled, one quiet truth lingered beyond the applause. In politics, the loudest cheers often conceal the softest warning, and the wisest leaders hear it first.